Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal, and sometimes people say to me, what's with Brent Cooper? Is he some kind of disgruntled hyperbolic ideologue who poisons all discussions with his monomania, or is he some brilliant socio-alchemical hermit proffering essential critique? What is the deal with this guy? Well, first of all, I like him. Second of all, we've got to collectively get over this limiting notion that we're only supposed to hear from people who make us feel good and don't challenge the smoothed out communication assumptions of our finely balanced collegial inclusive spaces. And thirdly, he's a good researcher and a good thinker who's constantly following up on facets of the liminal meta space that often slip through other people's cracks. So today we're going to explore that stuff. Let's get beyond the conversation about how Brent makes you feel and get a sense of what he's actually been thinking and working on, and maybe even invite some folks to sign up to his Patreon account, as I've done. So if you're playing along at home, grab your scorecards and pencils because it's time to amplify some projects by playing everyone's favorite new game show, What's Brent Cooper Been Up To?
Hey, Layman, good introduction as usual. Love your spirited, scripted setups. Let's slip through some people's cracks.
All right. Here's my first question, actually. It just popped into my head as I was setting that up, which is if I imagine a scenario in which I'm the imperial governor of all of these kind of communities of thought that we're dealing with, and I look at a Brent Cooper, what's he for? Like, what sort of unit is he in my army? What would I best be served to use a Brent Cooper for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I got an answer, but let me preface it first by saying, I also had a thought while you were giving the spiel, which is like, we're longtime collaborators in this sense, and you've been trying to rehabilitate me for years, rehabilitate my image rather, and that's a collective project. But part of me thinks it's old hat, and as I said to you just before, like that this is a process that includes other people, like my haters specifically. And so like nothing can change until that changes too. That's what makes this a systemic thing, a collective intelligence thing, if we want to use all these flashy buzzwords. And I'm sick of it. I'm sick of like pretending that like I'm this bad guy for other people's sake, or vice versa. Like I obviously am not perfect, not a saint, but like think there's a necessary role there. So to answer your question though, like one of the things that infuriates me about other wisdom spaces or movements or whatever post-religious stuff particularly is like, if you're gonna build a organized religion or cult or whatever around somebody like this mythical figure of Jesus, right? It's like, okay, like or Socrates, if we take like a more secular example, right? Who were Jesus or Socrates, right? Or Martin Luther King, for example. Everybody hated them in their lifetimes. Like, not everybody, but like they were at least hated by the establishment of the institutions of the time, and large swaths of the public. They were who were they, right? As roles, as functionaries, not just as people, but what did they do, right? What was their role? Why was Socrates put to death? Why was Jesus put to death? Why was Martin Luther King put to death? So, tongue in cheek, I'm trying to say, I'm them, I'm Jesus. I've said this before, other people have said this before, like, and that is what we should be aspiring to, like. And that's what's funny about getting into debates or non-debates about these things. It's like, why are you a Christian if you're not doing it? And so, but to finish that point, like, what did these guys do? They were rebels. They were disruptors. They were gadflies. They were critics. And they were philosophers. They were truthful, right? So they would say things that people didn't like because they were true, because they threatened the established order or whatever. And, so we all have a cross to bear, so to speak. I'm sick of it. I'm fucking sick of it, because it's something the point is actually to do it together. This is a collective project. It's not it's not a career path. It's not a jockeying thing. We either do it together or there's nothing. And so the most important people in these networks are the critics, because those are the Jesus and the Socrates and the Martin Luther King people that are going to get ostracized or killed or exiled or excommunicated for real superficial reasons, for real pathetic, transient, shallow reasons.
But the tagline for this video is "Brent Cooper claims to be Jesus." It's an interesting situation.
I saw
right?
myself in my toast.
How do you get that?
And then I ate it.
Solutions need to be convergent and collaborative, right? So you can go a certain distance in making yourself more amenable to people. They have to go a certain distance in understanding that. And at the same time, part of the problem are hidden ideological system functions that are haunting people that they don't know about, that produce the irritation that the critical, irritant, philosophical figure seems to be the source of. So that's a tricky one. But let's talk a little bit for a few minutes for people who have no idea who you are or any of this, because there's lots of people coming into these communities and they're not well versed. They don't have a history with it. What is the Abstract organization, and what do you mean by abstraction?
Yeah, well, the whole onboarding thing is something that I struggle with, but I think metamodernism as a whole struggles with. How do we meet and greet new people in various ways? And so, but abstract, for me, it's all very simple. It's not simple, but the core concept is simple, and it has to be simple. Right. So I made a film called The Abstract, and I've done a lot of research under this banner of the Abstract. And the way it connects is like in the mystical traditions to bridge high and low, abstract and concrete, all the body and mind, all these opposites that line up, that to some extent, if you drill deeper, also the distinctions blur, right? And there's this sort of absolute or kind of monadology, if you will. I don't like that term. Like Alexander Bard kind of uses that and talks about monads, and there's kind of oneness to the universe. So, but there are binaries, and there are threes and fours and fives, dimensionality of different things. So it's not just binaries like hot, cold, high, low, left, right, metamodernism, hypermodernism. Like these are constructive framings, men and women, right? There are all these binaries, but we also don't want to naturalize them too much, right? And we want to give them context. So the abstract idea is like, well, through all my research through university, it basically led me back to this question of what is abstraction? And so abstraction is thinking in the obviously the conventional definition is like there's multiple aspects to the definition, but we have to start somewhere, which is always why this is difficult. It's like, where do I start, and how do I draw people into the bigger picture of abstraction? And rightly or wrongly, I try to anchor it in thinking, because we all think, and thinking about thinking is a form of metacognition. Abduction is a third form of logic, and even meta abduction, the term has been used. And so there's all these recursive ways we can think about the thought process, but abstraction is not limited to thought, right? It happens in the world. It's also a social process. And it comes to constitute how we, use language, how we develop mythology, and it runs through a lot of philosophers' work. Marx and Hegel, right through to their antithesis, Jordan Peterson. And so, I want people to learn and think critically about the relationship between the abstract and the concrete. And you can also, and the various levels of that, because it's not black and white. There's infinite levels, and they insert into each other. And it's a very psychedelic thing at the end of the day. But we can have a quantum conversation about how your hand can pass through the table in theory, but it will never pass through the table. Right? It's always going to stop on the surface. And so that's where the abstract and the concrete collide. And on a mass scale, I think the world is suffering from a deep crisis of abstraction. And this is the term is used in talking about capitalism too, quite frequently. So I kind of, I got it in my mind about 8 years ago that, and I had a little help from the machine elves with these insights, but that abstraction was the key to everything. And it is and it isn't, right? It's one of these things, like in my introduction to abstraction and in some of the other introductory articles, I draw on some key papers that say things like abstraction makes you smarter. It improves education outcomes when you teach it explicitly. It helps with depolarization of politics. Like when you're able to ask why something is to multiple degrees, or to think abstractly about the political spectrum or about different factions, and to de-escalate through that process. So this is, I have got other ideas on other projects, but this is why I kind of use abstraction as my home base and try to demonstrate it in various ways. Like when it comes to abstracting metamodernism, you need to be able to, map the whole, collect all the data points, and sort of get an accurate high resolution map. And then you can distill and simplify and draw conclusions and whatnot. So, that's where my work, my research ethic intersects with that process of abstraction and thinking abstractly. And ultimately, I had taglines with the early project, like making critical thinking cool, like just this idea that if people could realize what they're doing when they think, which is always going to be a kind of personal path, personal experience. But if they can do that and at the same time, commit to some sort of path of meta learning or whatever, so that there's a convergence with that. So we're all coming from our different backgrounds and cognitive traps and thinking styles and social milieus, and getting a more accurate representation of reality together, right? So we don't have new age woo kind of crap and magical thinking, or ideological, political partisanship, coming into the process, into the movement, into the field of study.
Yeah, that's great. I find a lot of people refer to you as a researcher, and there's this idea that you are going into areas of problem or interest and like really exhaustively chewing through it until you get to this point of discovering these underlying abstract sort of high resolution schematics where you can draw a conclusion. And that's admirable. At the same time, it scares people because we exist in a lot of communities that pride themselves on being very fluid and balanced and, you know, inwardly contrarian. So when somebody draws a conclusion, it's a little bit off-putting. It's a challenging thing. I noticed in one of the online descriptions of the Abstract organization as a globally oriented meta think tank, it ended with this phrase, "All problems are solvable," which made me think about you having a kind of trust that you can apply a process to an area of concern and you'll get to some sort of concluding underlying abstraction in there. Now, some of that's the bravado you need in order to engage in a project to begin with. But where do you think you get this faith that the abstractions can really provide solutions for us? And when do you know you've reached that? Because I'm thinking about a situation like Russia, Ukraine. You know, I look at it and go, oh, here's a news story. The mainstream seems to be saying this. The counter mainstream seems to be saying this. There's a polarization. There's my deep awareness that probably I'm not hearing many of the things that are actually pertinent. And maybe the situation is completely some other situation. So there's so many areas where it just seems so open-ended. How do you know that you've dug into it enough to go, I can draw a conclusion here?
Yeah, that's a big two-part question, because when I say all problems are solvable, I mean that's true, and it extends to the Russia-Ukraine war or invasion, Russia's war. Let's call it that, because it's like Russia. I talked with Alexander Krolikowski about that. And you know, we agreed Russia is waging a war on two fronts, and actually, we also kind of agreed that the Russian people was the first theater of that war, right? And Ukraine is the second front, like Ukraine's getting the hot war. And the invasion aspect, but Putin and the Russian government and the plutocrats or whatever are waging a war on the Russian people effectively, right? With propaganda and, you know, propagandizing soldiers and to become soldiers and to be soldiers, and it's all very old paradigm stuff. So it's a more sticky, complicated problem to solve in real time because it's unfolding in real time. But coming back to the thrust of that statement, all problems are solvable, right? So I'm a generalist, right? And I've got different specialties, but like, you know, I love to draw from real simple examples like healthcare, or education, or you know, homelessness, or drug addiction, like these specific intersectional problems that it's like, oh, you know, how, you know, what a nightmare. What do we do about this? And in some sense, just like with wars, like we're facing it in real time. Reality doesn't have a sense of time and history like we do, like humans do. And so history has this memory that chases us, that reaffirms all these social problems. But my point is, when you study anything deeply enough, and I think PhDs would know this even more deeply, but also probably have less idealism than I'm proposing, but that all of these problems are, the deeper you dive into the research, you can see that somebody has already solved the problem. To some extent, like the problem, to solve homelessness, you have to essentially have a housing first policy, to put it as simply as I can put it, right? Because there's all these housing first movements that are like doing it and proving it and saying like, look, it's working. Aside from that kind of simple answer, obviously there's lots of other kind of things you need to tweak. Like you need to have, you need to have, prohibition lifted. You need to have drugs legalized as one, and you need to have social safety nets. You need to have free healthcare, and this is going to encourage mobility, job mobility, and regional mobility, and personal resilience. Right. So these are things that are gonna help in an entourage effect kind of way. But if you want those big levers of solutions, you got to have the abstract policy. And in this case, it's like housing first. And so with small problems, with big problems, like this, the humans are problem solvers potentially. And we create these huge technologies that obviously produce other problems, right? Like nuclear weapons technology, basically determined Cold War history, and for worse, very, very, very much, I would argue. But this is the history we have, not the history we want. So it's not about like thinking more and more and more abstractly until you think you've got it, but it's about making the abstract like be commensurate with the concrete, so that like your blueprints for design or whatever are the most consistent with the broadest material and social reality.
So part of what you're doing is searching around spaces for places where people have come up with solutions. And there are a lot of these where there's a good mapping between the abstract and the manifest, let's say.
Yeah, there was a good YouTube video that comes to mind. It was like, it's like a 2 or 3 hour video, I think. And it was titled something like 100 solutions to social problems or something. And it went point by point, like as swiftly and succinctly as one could do, to say like, this is the policy to address this. So that's just one example that comes to mind. There's also a ton of misinformation in the world, and like counter narratives and counterproductive work, right? And so this is part of the key, because this is what makes it so difficult to achieve or implement these solutions. And that obstruction, I call it detraction in the sense of opposing abstraction, but that's what makes it so difficult. Like at the level of discourse and of organizing, right? We're disrupted by trolls, by spies, whatever, by good faith people who are just wrong too, so all that is undermining our otherwise simple solutions to complex problems. And so we need to be able to identify it at the level of discourse to see like, well, if we're not getting it right here, there's going to be all these downstream negative effects.
So I want to come back to some of the classic website and Medium articles where you've employed this approach. But first, I want to ask, what's going on with TikTok?
Oh yeah. Well, I want to keep using TikTok. I really find it most useful, not as a creator at this point, but just as collecting research. So like, for example, with any movements or anything, it's good, but Ukraine in particular, for the past, well, let's say for the first 3 weeks of the conflict, the invasion. Sorry, see, words, using the right words is always so critical, right? That's why I don't mince words when I'm talking about like Israel, for example, being an apartheid state. And we'll make some connections there too with Ukraine, because my criticisms of Ukraine, which are important here, would be first and foremost the comparison Zelensky makes to Israel, saying that Ukraine and Israel are alike. So we'll get to that. Sorry, reiterate the question. briefly?
Yeah, I'm just curious to let people know what you've been doing on TikTok, because I've seen some of these
TikTok, right?
little videos of an
Yeah.
animated Brent Cooper.
Yeah, so no, not a lot of people have really seen those, and so it was a bit of an experiment just for me to work out a sort of pipeline for the editing process, the technology. And so I haven't posted since January. I basically tried to post a TikTok a day in January, just to see if I could keep up with it, right? To see like what that process would be like. It was just sort of an experiment, and I want to return to it, just like with YouTube, and use those different platforms in an interconnected way. But basically, as a test, nothing really happened. It didn't achieve much. But the point there is also just sort of make it a creative outlet, and to experiment with form, because there's a lot of people on TikTok that's just themselves talking to the camera, and that's great. That's fine, and I could do it a whole lot quicker if I did that once a day. And maybe I will, but like I said, right now, I'm still just experimenting with the form and the production pipeline, which is why. So the TikToks are all kind of animated with like me in cartoon form, and doing different things like playing video games, and trying to, set things up that might be able to connect later, if anybody's paying attention to those threads. But basically for now, I just find TikTok more useful for research, because it's very easy, or entertainment. Because if you just sit there and scroll on your For You page, the algorithm will show you things that you want to see, and sometimes things that you don't. But this is one of these cases, like, not to run from social media, but to immerse yourself in the experience, like knowing that the algorithms are creating an addictive impulse, and trying to balance that with like, consciously using it as a way to just pass time and entertain yourself, and passively learn, but also with that proactive and interactive mindset. Right. So, I'm on Twitter a lot, and that's also a good way to do research and just like and retweet other people and post brief thoughts. But there's a lot, like, there's just so many different levels, that and Twitter's hard to break through. But with TikTok, because you're being exposed to more random people, it seems to be a faster way to proliferate memes and ideas, and for them to become sort of quick movements, that rise and fall. So I'm interested in the phenomenon of TikTok as I dive into it, but also want to find a way to cut and post some of my content there that could generate a different conversation, a different audience with random people. Yeah.
Before we started recording, you were telling me about a tentative or partially completed project called the Fliminal Web, right? And there is this sense that the extended liminal web, or whatever this collection of overlapping communities is, finds it a little too easy to collectively conflate themselves into a single homogeneous entity. And then, of course, that's got to be balanced out a little bit with the practicality of making a big tent and the importance of leaving something open-ended in our self-definitions. But when you were talking about it, I was thinking about it sort of as a sequel to this really good article you wrote a while back on mapping metamodernism. And I was wondering what, if you see anything that's changed since you wrote that article, right? Because there might be, people talk about the dark renaissance or hell of metamodernism, or, do you have a sense that anything's really changed? Are there new things to take into account since mapping metamodernism was written? Or is it basically just the same as in that article?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the article was much more research based, right, than movement based and community based. And so, like, I noted how this project, Life Itself, you also use this term like mapping the metamodern ecosystem, and that in some ways that's like the opposite of what I was doing. So I should say, like, I'm all for big tent kind of framing and movements and everything, but yeah, when it comes to metamodernism, and then like slash game B slash integral slash this and that, all these things a lot of things I've criticized, that they don't go together that simply. And a way I thought about this before the call too is like, imagine if we said, hey, we're planning a sports weekend, and we're gonna have an academic conference, but we're gonna have a lot of sports too, and the sports, and like we're gonna have a game, and it's gonna be like a mashup of like football and hockey and tennis and croquet, whatever. Like who's game? Who wants to play? Everybody come and play our mashup sports event that I just made up. How is that going to work? What are the rules? What are the goals? Right? What are the teams? That's how absurd this stuff looks to me when you try to mash it up. Integral, metamodern, game B, blah blah blah. And same thing academically, right? It's like, let's pop off willy-nilly in the most interdisciplinary way we can, right? Like that's actually the end of postmodernism. Still, that's the limits of this postmodern discourse, to just like have this hyper plurality and blend it up and ultimately just fetishize the human connection part of it, and like ooh, let's gaze into each other's eyes and have a breathing workshop. Like it's really, really counterproductive, because, people might come away feeling like, oh, I had such a good workout at that, tennis slash hockey slash football sports event, but like, I don't even know what happened. And so, also there's a big difference that I recognize and accept between the research mapping and then the social game aspect of it. And when it comes to the social game, like you mentioned, Dark Renaissance, like I'm not even caught up, to be honest, on what they're talking about. I mean, I have a sense of it because I'm in those groups, but I'm not caught up, and I suspect I would just get frustrated watching, the Dark Renaissance versus Game B kind of stuff. And some other people have watched it, so I've gotten secondhand accounts. But what my point is that the ball is so fast moving in some of these things. So I saw that Joe Lightfoot did a kind of death of the liminal web ritual thing on the Stoa. Like I haven't watched it. I haven't watched that because I'm not that caught up. But like the ball is so fast moving. It's like if I was to make a video or write about the Fliminal Web, it's like, oh, people have already moved on from that. Like Ryan Nakade is somebody I was talking to about this too, a month or two ago, and the sentiment among us is like, we like already trying to go beyond that. And so I suspect that's kind of the thing with this, the death of ritual, because that's not a new thing either. It's like, it's a kind of habitual thing for these spaces to recognize, oh, as soon as we name something, it's dead. And the funny thing about that, like what comes to mind is Andrew Sweeney writing about the death of the IDW some years ago. And Robert Wright also used that phrase, the death of the IDW, I think later. And when Wright used it, it was a little bit more on time and appropriate. But even then, like, and I like Robert Wright, but like in both these cases, like the IDW type and space and the different spaces, the so-called heterodox spaces, they're alive and kicking. Like they're not healthy, but they're certainly not dead. and like we're always celebrating like, oh, something's named, the intellectual dark web is named, or the liminal web is named, and now we can eulogize it because we've named it. And there's something ironic and premature about all of that. And so these things are never just fade away, they mutate. And just a case in point, kind of what I find fascinating is watching Eric and Brett Weinstein fight each other on Twitter, because they're brothers and they're sort of colleagues, and they're core teammates on this Game B narrative as well as the intellectual dark web narrative. But it shows like they never really could constructively disagree. That was always a myth from the very beginning. And that and in my view, and in many leftist views, they're both cranks. It's not a question of like who's right and who's wrong. They're both cranks. Like when it comes to ivermectin and COVID conspiracies, Eric is taking the sort of rational, safe side of that debate, and Brett is taking the conspiracy theory kind of side of approaching things. But my broader point still is that we should distrust both of them and also distrust the people that trusted them, because these are ecosystems. So coming back to the Fliminal concept, like I'd love for that phrase to have currency. And that's, again, like, because I'm in the liminal web, this is a constructive dig at myself too. And it's an opportunity for me and others to be self-critical and self-effacing and say that, to an extent, we're all kind of bullshitting our way through life and through different things, but we're trying to be authentic, we're trying to be sincere, ironic, and all these things. So there's a tension there, and the more we recognize that tension and name it, the better, right? So I when I see the liminal web, I see the Fliminal web. I see a lot of flim-flam. I see a lot of superficial conversations. I see a lot of mutual back-patting and self-back-patting. And I see a lot of running from and evasion of the most core critiques and people examining their past mistakes. And so, the core of that bubble has like Rebel Wisdom, the Stoa Perspectiva. I always forget who's, the exact way that it's drawn in concentric circles, but it seems the center ones are just the loudest and the most popular. They're the ones kind of producing the most content and setting the narrative in various ways. But insofar as it is a mashup, I don't think anybody is really grokking anything except what's popular, right? And so, like our dispatches book, and I want to call it our book, normatively, ostensibly, I want to call it our book. I don't know what it is. It's you and Jonathan edited it. There's things I think are great about it in terms of its aspirations, in terms of its overall structure. I think it's got a lot of strengths, but not only can I be critical of it, like I'm inspired to be critical of it, like it's an object that could be operationalized and fruitful for discourse, because there's all these premises in it, like Vervaeke's, authentic dialogue or whatever, but then there's kind of challenges issued, like the concept of metanoia that I introduce. So we're yet to wrestle and grapple with that. And if this is supposed to be some sort of long-term thing, like for posterity, for future students and generations, then are we supposed to just move on to the next thing quickly and let that thing do its work? Or, as I would propose, maybe we should dwell on it for a bit, constructively workshop it, talk about it.
There's a curious tension there, right? Because so many of the things in the world require much more urgency than we're bringing to it. And so many of those things also require us to go slower and dwell longer on things rather than quickly move on to the next. Your thing about the mashup sports is interesting to me, right? I sort of think there's a potential for these overlapping communities to form some kind of body. But when you have a body, the left foot is not doing the same job as the pancreas. They've got to be structurally distinguished somehow. And yet this other problem is the existing terms we have, whether it's Metamodern or Game B or the liminal Web or integral, those may not name the actual organs in the body, right? So maybe there's lots of people from the left foot that are in what we're calling the pancreas right now. So there's going to be a lot of ambiguity, and somehow we've got to try to clarify what these edges are, but also imagine that the categories might be different than the ones we're naming. It seems very inchoate at the moment.
It's inchoate in the moment now, but hasn't it always been? Like, so for me, like the continuity of these things goes back to 2016. That's when a lot of us intersected through Hansi, through Hansi's sort of group and organization, and I'm always like indebted to that. But like from the beginning, I tried to bring this message of like a broader metamodernism, and thankfully I can endorse like 99% of Hansi's authority and contributions to the term, to metamodernism, to say that that's what it is. But I've always had this historicizing and problematizing approach, which is the key. That's part of the key of a real broader metamodernism. And so it still hasn't achieved a proper academic turn. If it achieved a proper academic turn, every academic would be aware of it and would be using it to various extents. Instead, it's just these little cliques and subfields that, like every other subfield, produces a ton of work and discourse, but that ultimately has limits in how far it can, be distributed and functional. And to various extents, like that's built into the way it's written, into the code, like Vermeulen and Van den Acker and Gibbons' approach, that whole school of thought I call the Dutch school. They make it explicit, like this is just our little corner of the internet that we're going to carve out and have some conferences, and it's not normative, it's not prescriptive, it's just a descriptive enterprise of this these cultural products and film and literature and art and so it's a very generative discourse, but self-limiting. And one of the greatest strengths I take from it that they don't build off of is the kind of geopolitical perspective and the kind of historical moment, which is both the periodization and the historicism, the new historicism of kind of trying to relearn and rewrite history. And so, for 4 or 5 years solid, people in these groups would just have read one school of thought, one or the other, Hansi or the other, and not done any deeper research. So that's still kind of what I'd like to see shift and reset, like, and with newer, more official contributions like Jason Storm's book published by University of Chicago. That's significant in one sense, but it's also another sign of the times that, like, you see it published the same time our book was published, and that it comes and goes. It's a blip on the radar, and it's not dramatically changing anything. And even like the publisher themselves, like University of Chicago, they're not just simply by publishing it, they're giving a sort of endorsement, of course, but they're not officiating an academic turn.
You think we need to clarify a more normative and prescriptive understanding of metamodernism and not lean so heavily on a descriptive collection approach?
Yeah, and I think everybody involved, everybody who's ever been drawn to this term, should not be thin-skinned and should not be so easily distracted and diverted. And so like one person that comes to mind that I don't know personally, like other people, but who was a big name from the beginning, is Francis Fukuyama. It's like, he doesn't use the term publicly, but he was a part of the Dutch school, so to speak. And, he's a famous conservative kind of political scientist and theorist. And, he was for the Iraq War and then later regretted it. But my critique to him and everybody else is like, you're letting down the project. And here's why. One is you've just abandoned the term that you helped foster. Another is you're still doing your same shtick, right? And so Francis Fukuyama has like changed and evolved over the years, but he's still doing his same shtick. And I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. It's ugly. It's counterproductive. And so what I mean by that is like, if you're going to be a public intellectual, be a public intellectual. Get in the fight and get dirty and help us beat, people like Peterson or help define the metamodern movement. And so for every Fukuyama, there's 100 others as well doing the same thing. Like what is Zizek doing with his life, with his career? I'm obviously, I have some fondness for him for various reasons. He's a card carrying leftist. But he's like co-founded or is like one of the editors of a new magazine called Compact Mag. And all the people I follow on Twitter on the first day of its publication were like, this is like reactionary left. Nina Power is involved with that publication. And so is Glenn Greenwald, right? And so Nina Power has also been attached to the word metamodernism, but again is another person, as far as I can tell. She doesn't like operationalize the word. She doesn't count herself as part of it. I'm not 100% sure, but there's just no evolution along that line. And so if it's true that this magazine is kind of just reactionary left and some little bit of red-brown alliance kind of stuff, which means like the far left and the far right kind of try to collaborate and see eye to eye, that's hugely problematic and embarrassing for the left, and does not bode well for a metamodern turn, because again, the way I define it is building off the best traditions, looking at the things that were missed, the anomalies, and revising accordingly. And then, trying to build consensus and solidarity around that. And so there's some aspects of all this mashing up, obviously, that work, and we talk about like solar punk, Afrofuturism, MMT, I like to mash those things up too and say like, and say like, this is the recipe. Let's just churn that cauldron. It'll work because the ingredients will work.
So that might be true if we knew what the key ingredients were, and how much of them
exactly
to mix.
And that's what I'm saying. I have a different idea of that from many of these other groups. And in the specific examples I was just giving, I'm pointing at people like Fukuyama or Nina Power, Luke Turner, for example, who blocked me on Twitter years ago for no reason, really, no good reason. It's like, okay, do your thing, but like, is this your metamodernism? Is this what you believe in further alienating yourself too? And effectively abandoning the term, or just using it to create performance art that people talk about? It's got to be a broader, more inclusive thing and turn without diluting itself, or it's nothing. It's just a passing fad.
So here's a little bit of a segue, which is, one of our kind of cousin communities, the intellectual deep web and its sort of dark renaissance project offspring there, consists of a bunch of people with whom we could have some degree of solidarity. They've been prominent lately in proposing a kind of critical challenge to technocratic positivist elements within Game B. And I think that's probably useful in terms of the different organs in the system being able to challenge each other. But one of the things I saw, speaking of them, was on your Patreon page, a talk with Alexander Bard. Mm-hmm. And it's curious because I can imagine you guys, and I saw a bit of you guys having a lot in common and having a lot not in common. So I think it would be interesting to hear, like, what do you and Alexander Bard agree about? What do you disagree about? And are you currently a syntheist?
Yeah, I like syntheism. Syntheism's always been a big part of my attraction to his work, let's say, because it really accurately captures something. I can't so strongly endorse the rest of his work. That's not to say it's wrong, but it's just a little bit more, it's very dense on one hand, but it's also sort of fast and loose on the other hand. And syntheism is just like, I think, a really clean concept and approach, both on the abstract theory side, but also on the practical. Like, he's like given a talk at a Burning Man event about it to say, like, this is a Burning Man type of emergent religion. Right? That's the practical sense, and with its pros and cons. But on the theory side, it basically solves or transcends the old atheism theism divide, which lots of people get hung up on. And in fact, the way you're taught it as a student is to kind of to wade into those debates, which are just they're just like quicksand at the end of the day. Like, listening to a debate between an atheist and a theist is like, it's a type of intellectual hell. Whereas, like, you look at pantheism, the American transcendentalists, or Eastern philosophy, which the transcendentalists drew from hugely. It's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more pantheistic. And then so syntheism is like pantheism on the internet. And so, that's just an easy one to connect with. But that the conversation I posted is from a year ago. I just never got around to posting it until like last couple months. But it's, one of my it's the second interview I posted with him. But one of the big takeaways is that, like, Bard is he can be so sort of hostile over email, which I can be too, to an extent, not as much as him, mind you. But then in person or in conversation, he's very jovial and likable, and kind of, he's a good listener. if I start talking and cut him off, he'll just listen. But the part of the friction of both of our interviews is like I'm coming into it like with an intent to challenge him and being transparent about that, so he knows, right? And he's playing with that, and then the ways in which it goes sideways is something I'm observing also as a kind of third person. I'm thinking critically about that as it's happening and before. And so I've called him over emails and to his face, like reactionary, like part of this reactionary movement or whatever, like, because I'm usually referring to the right when I say reactionary. It's largely a right-wing phenomenon. Corey Robin has written about the reactionary mind, but there's also a lot more to say in terms of like the different specific iterations that come up, like the intellectual dark web thing, insofar as the kind of anti-Marxism, Red Scare, kind of McCarthyism through line, insofar as that's present. It's just a redux of the 1950s kind of Red Scare, anti-communism kind of hysteria and moral panic. And so insofar as Bard or Game B or whoever participates in that narrative and supports it and upholds it, that's reactionary. The Stoa is reactionary because it's hosting a lot of reactionaries. And I used to be a lot more tolerant and forgiving and say like, oh, you're not reactionary, you're just associating with reactionaries. And then you get the typical response like, oh, what is this, guilt by association? Which just like ad hominem, I think there's a place for it. It's not always a fallacy. People need to understand that it's not always a fallacy. But now my position has shifted to just saying you're a reactionary. You're not adjacent to reactionaries. You're a reactionary. And so just as I said a moment ago, like Zizek is part of a particular left reactionary narrative. That's not the only thing he does, right? But like he's a part of that, and by the same token, like Jordan Hall or people like him, my critique against them is they've supported this reactionary right movement, and now I'm comfortable just saying, to Hall or whoever, like, you are a reactionary, a different flavor than Brandon Hayes or whatever, but a lot of people are just reacting, and as soon as a new news narrative comes up, whether it's George Floyd protests or the Ukraine war, they pivot and they jump on it and they go, oh, I'm the expert that people need to hear from on this, and they don't know, but they're continuing a reactionary narrative. And the treatment for that, if not the cure, is first of all to name it, and for them to accept that name, like for them to realize, oh, I'm a reactionary. Like once you realize what's going on, then you can start to change, make a better impact. And
that's tough for people. I mean, that's an interesting kind of critique, and to recognize it about yourself, and then to also, on top of that, be able to emotionally accept it as a label that might be applicable to you. That's pretty tough.
It doesn't have to be. Just briefly, it's not a slur, and neither is the word racist, like or fascist. Like how absurd is it that you have a bunch of racist slurs, and then for somebody in a wrong-headed way to shift the frame, and go, oh, the term racist is a slur. right? That's a kind of double negative, because like racial slurs are examples of slurs. The word racist is not a slur, and neither is reactionary. And this is why political scientists use these terms and use them in specific constructive ways. It's not an insult. It's not a slur. It's just a fact that person has to learn what it is. And this is what's so infuriating for me personally. It's like everybody wants their hand held, and they want a participation trophy for like learning.
So we've got to destigmatize reactionary within the extended liminal web.
Yeah, and while I say it's not a slur, it's not a positive thing either, right? It's not a term of endearment. You can't rehabilitate it. You can't be a good reactionary. So this is why people conflate it with an insult and a slur, because it can't be a good thing. but yeah, that's it.
I was going to ask you about how you would characterize differences between you and Bard in terms of economic analysis. How you feel about capitalism.
That came up in the interview. I was able to get a bunch of plugs in for MMT. What became apparent is that Bard, and maybe it's his training as an economist, but he not a lot of people still are really versed in the different MMT discourses, right? So it's one thing to be aware of it, which Thomas Bjorkman is, and we were able to flesh out some of that in the interview I hosted between him and Andres Bernal. Alexander Bard also sounded like he was aware of it, but is not tracking any of the discourse. And so, like, I told him to check out Superstructure podcast and stuff like that. And he was compliant, and he, sort of said to the audience, like, yeah, check out these podcasts, right? But there's not a lot of follow-up with these things, and it is hard to track some of these discourses. But I feel like he's got some reactionary ideas about economics. He's a classical Marxist in some sense, and he probably wouldn't agree with that, but I'm trying to describe the differences between our approaches, right? And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of like new economics approaches which are just potentially pie in the sky, but it seems to be that the many key insights of MMT is the abstraction of money, and how we can sort of create it to pay for these problems. So there's a fundamental assumption, even people who are creative thinkers about economics, that like the tax and spend kind of rhetoric or mantra becomes reified, and MMT decouples them. MMT says we can have a sort of compartmentalized discussion about taxes and tax the rich and whatnot, and look at it not as a way to gather the financing or the budgeting for other things, that they're decoupled, that when it comes to funding the best ideas, like a Manhattan Project for energy or a Green New Deal, or both, if they're the same, we need to like build a consensus, which is what the project is, right? Of the MMT community, for example, or the Bernie movement, or the Green New Dealers, and then institutionalize it, make it a reality. And that means to pull the trigger. It's a poor choice of words, but to make it happen, because it still hasn't happened. Like the Manhattan Project happened. Mm-hmm. And it was an incredible feat of human organization and engineering, and it happened, and it was funded. but these other things like a Green New Deal, it hasn't happened yet.
Mhm.
And so we're so far behind.
So if it comes to sort of like, let's just assume in the communities we're primarily discussing, you could hypothetically get some kind of agreement around MMT that it could move forward on. So then I'm thinking, what's the gap there? Because, MMT pervades a lot of your writings, particularly a lot of the nice Medium articles. It comes up in that discussion with Bjorkman and Bernal. Incidentally, I had a great conversation with Bjorkman the other day. I had a lovely talk with Bernal last year. I'm really impressed by some of the things I hear in modern monetary theory, right? It lays out a plausible reframing of how monies and economies work, which, if true, seems like it could make society run a lot better. So I love that about it. But still, there's a part of me emotionally that says that's a bit conservative, that thinks, well, I mean, it's completely untested. What we have now is not necessarily the best, but we're just going to possibly drive the entire vehicle off a cliff, jumping to something that is unproven. And when I raised that with Bernal, he said, well, yeah, but the situation is urgent, and there are many terrible things about the way we're already doing it. It's not like we have a lot to lose, but in people's hearts, it's debatable whether we have a lot to lose. And I'm curious, what distance would I have to cross to be all in on it? What was it that you saw about it where you were able to go, yes, absolutely, that's the way forward?
Yeah, I think which really solidified my interest was seeing actually the common gestures with metamodernism, which is this grounded idealism about a paradigm shift and about rethinking the social imaginary, right? And I tried to integrate that in my 3-part series based on Bjorkman's book. So it kind of starts with his premises and it kind of ends with MMT premises. And it's not a perfect synthesis, but I was trying to bridge that gap to say, they're both talking about the social imaginary and really with the superstructure and money on the left collective, it's the film analysis, the media analysis, the left commitments, right? The commitments to queerness, to the kind of queering discourse and the social justice LGBTQ movements that are associated with that. So there was just an unapologetic solidarity with their different movements and their different traditions and influences, and their new readings of things like Marx, right? And so Marxism has been this age-old topic that new generations of scholars bring different readings and different applications to it. And so this is yet another one. And so is Metamodernism, right? And so in the way they approach sort of classical theory and the world historical moment, I think there's a lot of potential convergence. And that was the point of the Bernal-Bjorkman crossover, was sort of, and for me to articulate that gesture, that direction for it. And I would say a lot of MMT is proven. I think Bernal would say that too. A lot of it is just macroeconomic theory about how the world works and about how money and economy work specifically and how it's worked over the past 100 years specifically. And then how it's worked over the last 50 years and the last 10 years specifically too. So there, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it through an abstract analysis, which is to say, I think the more time goes on, the more abstract money gets, and the more like you said, quoting Bernal, there's a urgency now. The more time goes on, the more I think the abstraction of money is decoupled from its materiality, meaning it becomes easier in a sense to just add numbers to the ledger, because it's not going to affect the the base, or it's not going to affect it as much as we think it is. Instead, what's going to happen is that money is going to be used to build metamodern society, right? So and so again, like I said in the interview, like the Green New Deal, and Bernal's very close to working on that. That's a real easy meme to get behind. And yet Jim Rutt was opposed to it because he didn't think we could afford it. Right. And so this is the crux of the argument. It's like Jim's wrong with his analysis and his number crunching. And that comes directly from his sort of ideological priors and biases. And the truth is, we can't afford not to do it. It's exactly, just one example of these macro interventions that need to be made that will improve the lives of millions of people almost instantly. And then for us to see the effects of saving the planet, that's got to happen pretty quickly too. But it's gonna take time to see those effects. Like it takes years to build mega projects, and some mega projects fail, right? This is where the conservatism that you speak of comes from. Nevertheless, this is the project, to keep building political will and scientific consensus so that these things converge, and so that there's less and less contention and confusion at the next World Economic Forum or Metamodern conference or whatever, or what the sports mashup.
Well, I'm 80 to 85% of the way there.
Also, just to be more specific, what really hooked me is, like I said, the film analysis they do, but just to go even deeper, because they've covered Jaws, they've covered Star Wars, they've covered MCU as a whole, as well as specific things like Loki, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, WandaVision. They've talked about all these things in depth, and that just solidifies my sort of interest in literacy and commitment.
One of the difficulties for a lot of people is imagining that the world and economy could be any different than it is. Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things in the big Graeber-Wingrove history book that came out last year was this notion that in early human societies, it might have been easier to imagine alternative ways of organizing ourselves, in part because people could always just leave if they didn't like what was going on, in part because tribes tended to come and go from city living. And so the solidity, the fixity of the social systems we set up was more permeable than it is now. And they argue that we've sort of entered into a political economy that's locked down our imaginal alternatives to such a degree that we can't even imagine our ancestors as having done anything different than initiating the path that leads to the cul-de-sac we're in now. And when I think about that cul-de-sac, because you're describing some positive possible trajectories, like a metamodern system fueled by MMT, but we are also in a tricky cul-de-sac and also moving down some dark paths. And that brings me to the excitingly titled article you wrote on the hypermodern highway to hell. What is that article about?
Yeah, for me, it was the sister article to the Mapping Metamodernism one. So, because I like the framing, which Albert Borgman initiated, but he didn't really carry on with it, and nobody else did either, but that postmodernism bifurcates and has these dominant trends. And so I'm following that revisionism line, which I wrote about in Missing Metamodernism. But then the hypermodernism thing was like, I noticed that not a lot of people were talking about it, and that just like with metamodernism, when you comb through the literature, you find a lot of it is disconnected from others. And there, the term is used in slightly different ways. One person will be like, I'm coining this, and another person will be like, I'm coining this. And so they're not talking to each other, and they're not on the same page. But there was a lot of consistency to it. Just like there's a relative consistency to metamodernism, right? It's a salient meme. And so I tried to just do a literature review basically and say, like, there's all this imagery that's helpful, like hollowed out shopping malls. But largely, I think a lot of us can relate to it with addiction to technology, the ego rearing its ugly head, regardless of, how many ego death experiences you've been through. And yeah, capitalism itself, right? Capitalism and hypermodernism go together, just like metamodernism and eco-socialism go together. And, I don't know why it's taking people so long to get that, to get on board with that, but that's what the literature shows across those two fields. And so, yeah, and seeing in developing that article and juxtaposing it, we can see that in some sense, hypermodernism is winning. This is why you have Trumpism and Brexit and all this nonsense, which is just, it's fake democracy and it's diversions from from people's actual needs and desires. Like, it's a very, very superficial. It's a dangling a treat or a shiny object that then a dumbed down population is attracted to. I don't like the reads of Trumpism or Brexit that try to make it make sense, if you know what I mean. And I'm happy to adapt my language based on who I'm talking to and who's receptive to critiques about those things. But this is that slippery slope and that ratchet theory where we start to talk about, Brexit makes sense, actually. Trumpism makes sense, actually. We're just capitulating further to the reactionary narrative. And this is what MMT people warn against too. Stop taking capitalist assumptions and priors for granted and stop letting it be such a pervasive feature of our discourse. Right. So this is why writing about hypermodernism and thinking about it really gives you a clear sense of what the harms and the evils are of selfishness, of hyper individualism, which is what people like Peterson are on about. It's extremely pathological, right? And the hypermodern is that at scale aggregate sense of what we're all doing to participate in that structure. So we're on a hypermodern highway to hell. The internet is the information superhighway, and there's great things about the internet and what it's enabled, but it's also bringing to the surface and fleshing out all these dark sides, all these shadows and tumors and warts.
So one of the things that stands out to a lot of people lately about technocratic hypermodernism is the problem of our attention being hacked and undermined, our ability to sustain focus and clarity, and our tendency to be able to think clearly apart from simple polarized emotional reactions, which are very engaging and addictive and hook us into media devices, social networking, news cycles, and things like that. So part of that has to be solved at the structural level of changing the circumstances in which people are in, giving them different tools, obviously their social support, their diet, a huge number of things make a factor to that. But another one is internal practice. And I think a lot of people probably don't know that you have an interesting article trying to clarify the algorithm of meditation, coming at it largely from a 8 limbs Patanjali Upanishadic approach. But I think that's something people wouldn't normally associate with you. And as a person who's been focused on meditation instruction for years and who's often thought, how can I simplify and encode and maybe even make an algebra out of how these practices work? What was your take there? What is your summary of the algorithm of meditation, and are you still doing that kind of internal work?
That's a great question. So let me implicate myself first of all to say I don't really have a current practice. I'm not really disciplined. I'm still just trying to get my basics together, which in principle meditation should play a large part, but nevertheless I don't really have a practice. I did have a practice, which is kind of what that article was gesturing towards, and it was partly just to go through some of the research and frame meditation as yet another example of abstraction. And so let me start there, because it was a big part of my journey of figuring out spirituality and also this intellectual project. So, for much of my adult life, I've pursued yoga and meditation, and been to different sites around the world, and did a 10-day Vipassana retreat once, which was kind of a rite of passage for me, I guess. Like, it's not an easy thing to do. It's something I wanted to put myself through, both as kind of a vacation and a reprieve from life, which it really served as, but also as a challenge and as a test, because it's very difficult to sit there in silence for 10 days and be hungry and think about sex and things like this. And so this is the practical system and sort of community movement aspect of meditation to an extent, is to be able to truly listen, and equanimity, is kind of the top line goal, if there is one, because meditation helps you find that stillness in life, whether it's through listening to your inner chatter or trying to quiet it or whatever. And one of the key takeaways that, I knew this before, but the retreat really brought it home, is that for meditation to really work, and more specifically for monasticism to work, you need that structure. You need it to be free. You need a building. You need the volunteers to make it happen. And a sort of donation network is what keeps alive the Vipassana tradition around the world. And so it's very clear that you need that to do it right and to go deep. But so that aside, for me, when I wrote the article to kind of crystallize what I'd been thinking and working on through the Abstract, is that never mind the retreats and that whole thing for a moment, just because I say that it's necessary to really advance, and also as a social practice, it's necessary. But that doesn't mean individuals can't meditate anytime, anywhere, right? They can. And so what is it? What is meditation? Well, in the simplest sense, and this is what I tried to make clear in the article, it's just sitting still. Ideally, you're trying to perform a good posture so you can last longer and be still longer and be comfortable, not wear yourself out. Like, there was a guy at the retreat actually who had the worst posture. He was just like hunched over. Gravity was just ruining his spine. And, we weren't allowed to talk, but I approached him after. And I kind of said that, hey, I noticed you, and I said, you might be more comfortable and more effective in the long run if you try what I do, which is to actually, before you get into a deep meditation, force yourself up, use your arms and push off your knees and develop a tall spine, rigid structure, which is what yoga teaches you to do anyways. And then relax and try to maintain that muscular stability while also relaxing, right? And so what I was saying was, you can't just stack your spine if your muscles if your muscles can't get into that position because they're so tightened forward, right? And he was really appreciative of my kind of advice and my intervention. So anyways, back to the point though, the abstract point of meditation, and the word abstract means to withdraw, right? And so in the mental sense, that means to, withdraw into your mind and think about the characteristics and the essential features of a thing that make it the thing, right? That make a table or a car a car. And so you withdraw. And so this is where it connects with ancient traditions. Like they would literally go off, wander off into a cave or to the forest or the desert and just withdraw into themselves. And so, and to bring it back to spirituality, spirit just means breath, and spirituality means your lifetime of breathing, the in and out, the ebb and flow of the universe, which sort of begins with your first breath of air and ends with your last gap and gasp. And meditation, bringing it back to equanimity, is also about dealing with that death anxiety and preparing yourself for death, preparing yourself for the final sleep or whatever. So that article tries to do two main things, which is try to define meditation in abstract terms and try to define abstraction in meditation terms. Right. So we get that sort of implementation or fusion of the abstract and concrete practice. And then also, uniting mind and body, again, whatever that sort of, imaginary dualism means, fusing it or dividing it. Because there is, when you get into the weeds, there is different types of meditation. Right. And so you have the very abstract type where you're kind of, you can make your mind go blank, or you can be visualizing something. And so, the ultimate meditation, I think, is just the stillness, the sitting, the listening, the breathing, observing the breath. But that's not to say you can't also gain from switching modes and having, there's a loving kindness meditation. I think on the flip side of that, there could be like a critical meditation where you work through critical problems. And that's why I haven't, in the abstract film, there's a joke where Luke, the protagonist, is meditating too hard. And he's like face is scrunching and he's wincing and he's doing biceps, like flexing your why questioning muscle, and he's just like breaking down, and then the coach kind of intervenes. He's like whoa, take it easy, you're going too hard, right? So, and that's I'm being tongue in cheek, but I think there's something to that. And so, so to conclude, kind of, I do advocate for, I should have more of a practice myself, but when it comes to like mindfulness meditation, like a lot of us do that all the time. Like I have a dog now, so when I walk my dog, that's a mindfulness meditation a lot of the time. So we don't need to overthink it, but yeah, it's good to have a discipline to get your life in order and approach these complex things with more equanimity. But it's also, it's a lifetime pursuit, and it's not the be all end all either. At the end of the day, what matters more than having a committed fetishized path, if you're an aesthetic, or if you're if you're celibate monk or whatever it is, I honestly believe that you start to flirt with too much dogma, right? Like as soon as if you commit to like, this is my personal religion, you're asserting some kind of dogma against yourself, which is, if I don't do this every day, things aren't going to work out. But when the truth is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All that matters in the end is kind of what you do with it, right? And so this is where the article is mostly talking in the abstract about the practice, but the rest of my work, like I had a really good conversation with Nate and Ryan on the Meta Ideological podcast. We talked a lot about liberation theology, and how that connects with my so-called spirituality, and why I'm not as vocal as other people about meditation practices or spiritual practices or whatever, because that is where I kind of try to show how other people are doing it and how we should be doing it, because that's what spirituality is for, and that's what we're openly conspiring for. So the abstract approach wins the day at the end, even if I don't win. I think the abstract approach will always be the most effective at unpacking what something is, and then also putting it back together into praxis.
Yeah, and certain kinds of inner practices build strength to be able to do that if we then deploy it. As a guy who's spent a lot of time thinking through the dynamics of meditation and other practices, unless we want to lump them all into the definition meditation.
Yeah, and much available. More than I have, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, and there's definitely, I think, in our communities, we need the stability and capacity building that's afforded by these practices. But when it comes to broader transformation, they're insufficient, right? At the very least, because they take a long time, and possibly because people might apply them in misguided fashion. So if we think, well, if we just have the civilization we have and we just start to fill it up with people who are great meditators and yogis and who are nicer, more decent people with more loving kindness, then we'll improve the world. Well, that'll help. But it's not quick enough and it's not broad enough. Bjorkman interviewed me the other day and we talked about your article, Manifesting Mass Metanoia, a little bit.
Great.
And I came back to mentioning that psychedelics and politics as key areas of a faster driver of change than the long-range life of meditative inner development, which is important. People should be doing therapy. They should be doing meditation. They should be doing different kinds of contemplative practices. That's essential, but it's not quick. None of these things are quick, but some things are quicker than others. And if we need people to open, we need people to change, we need people to do things that might incite change in the world, then it has to be more visceral. All right? And one of the things psychedelics and politics both have in common, aside from the letter P, is it's something people can get involved in right away, and it can potentially cause change in you very quickly.
Yeah. So there, Hansi advocates for meditation practice at scale, through things like introducing it into schools and stuff, and citing all the stack of research that supports meditation, right? That shows, the starting point is recognizing that it's already kind of proven. Again, it's one of these things, right? And that, these Vipassana retreats also show you a video about the Indian prison system and how, when introduced there, right, it really was effective. Again, proves itself. It lowers recidivism. It lowers like the negativity of the prisoner experience, and so there are ways to advocate for and legislate for, not forcing it on people, like you can't do that, but you need to make it available as a service. And so again, what you were talking, I was thinking, again, one of the key points is how encircled it is by capitalism. How many of these gurus and stuff are practitioners within a capitalist system, and it's their sort of career or their job, their entrepreneurship, but within capitalism, right? And so there's an irony of it becoming, mindfulness and a corporate practice, and then it's just wrong. It's just pathological. And so Yeah, because it's asking you to meditate on everything but the core problem. The way the economy is structured, the way capitalism organizes us and motivates us. So yeah, so there's that. And then psychedelics, it's part of the same conversation. And it was part of my metanoia article. Like, there's these various psychedelic turns. It became sort of culturally mainstream in the 60s and 70s, and academically mainstream in the kind of 90s even, and 2000s. And now again, there's another kind of renaissance, which is the same old renaissance, actually, of like, let's make it legal. What's taking so long, right? Like, Canada only legalized cannabis in 2019, 3 years ago, and they did so begrudgingly, almost, because Health Canada just, not long before that, was running anti-cannabis propaganda ads. So and this is one of these things that a lot of us actually agree on already. The intellectual dark web, as reactionary and anti-intellectual as it is mostly pro legalization. And the rest of us in kind of Metamodern and other spaces, Alexander Bard, we're all pro psychedelics. And I'm a big advocate. However, it's one of these things, like everything else, like, it needs to be coupled, maybe not coupled is the right word, but networked with all these other changes that have to happen at the same time, right? And to support and embrace the facilitation part of it. And again, like, we can't just leave it to the gurus who are just sort of either cultists or opportunists or both. It needs to become a part of healthcare, right? And such that you have and then these these gurus and stuff can also become a part of that institution, but it needs to be normalized and demystified. And again, it's not a cure-all. It's just one piece of the puzzle that helps people really viscerally, I think you said that word, connect with reality, and like have a spiritual experience, whatever that might mean. Like, it often means a lot of things in the context of metanoia. It's an intellectual change and transformation at the same time. And it, the effects don't last forever, but the effects in the short term are very profound. And it gives you an opportunity to make some fundamental choices and rearrangements in your life. And because psychedelics are so strong, I think they're less prone to abuse, like alcohol or even cannabis is, just because they're so powerful. You do it, you maybe never want to do it again, or you don't want to do it again for a couple months or a year or whatever. But there's always new things coming to light about what it is, what's happening. In large part, like I touch on in the chapter, and like Peter Shosted H, his work, whatever, however you pronounce his name, he says psychedelics are part of the philosophical tradition proper, which I'm very fond of that approach. I think it holds up historically, and I think it holds up just in terms of like thinking about ontology, or thinking about whatever. kind of lost the point there, but it holds up. And by the same token, it's like the the theory that Jesus was just a mushroom cult, like it's more plausible. It's more plausible than the official narratives we've kind of gotten historically. So yeah.
We're probably getting close to the end now. There were a lot of interesting articles, and some of the names are great, and just some of the subject matter is great. I enjoyed the Zeitgeist article. I thought, a reappraisal of Hart and Negri's empire is fantastic. That's something a lot of people should be engaged in. I thought the title Israel Politic, fabulous.
You're talking about super old stuff now.
Yeah, super
going
old
back,
stuff.
Going back a decade. But I appreciate it.
There's a lot of gems there. And they're a little bit, it's like they're interred a little bit. And I wondered from your point of view, when you think back, what's your favorite? What are you proud to have written in that early section?
That's a great question, because I think about that stuff from time to time. In one sense, it's like just me learning how to write university essays. But I have mixed feelings about how it looks published, right? Because those are not meant for a general audience. But I look back on them very fondly and constantly, try to carry those ideas forward with mixed results. Some of it I've not picked up on, and I've not picked up the thread again. And you mentioned Israel Politique. That is one of my favorites because it's one of my favorites because I still think it's very relevant. I do want to pick up that term and that thread again somehow, and whether it's writing an article or making a video or something. I think it's a great thesis. I think it holds up. But I also, got a very high mark on it. I was I'm not to say marks mean everything, but it was very personally validating because I was not expecting it. I worked very hard on the essay to make sure it was well written, but I got, it was funny how it happened because it was the big term paper for this 4th year history course. I think it was a year-long course. And so it was like the end of the year, it was the middle of the year kind of paper, but it was like the big paper. They announced at the beginning of the class, it's like a class of 150 people. They announced what the highest mark was. And that's all they said. They said the highest mark was this, and they didn't say what it was about or who it was. And we're all sitting there eagerly, and then I got my paper back, and it was the highest mark in the class of 150 people. So I felt really validated and felt like I did the right thing. And that could be read in different ways, you got the highest mark because it's just towing the line of telling the teacher what they want to hear. But it's a very controversial subject. And I tried to approach it in the most balanced, but with conviction way, right? It was a kind of proto-metamodern approach to really weigh the false balance of this debate publicly, how it's debated. And I never got it published anywhere other than just uploading it to Scribd. But I got the highest mark, and I also got an award for it because the teacher had submitted it for something without my knowledge. So it was a small award, but meaningful to me. And so there's that. Everything else I wrote was convergent at the time, because as a 4th year student, I also created a upper level seminar, like a graduate kind of seminar with another student. And the thrust of that was to look at all these different themes, critical theory and international relations and different theories, and ask the big questions, where is it all headed? How does this all converge? And basically how do power and knowledge and secrecy. And that course was where I wrote, that seminar is where I wrote my sort of towards a theory of conspiracy article. So that's where these things dovetail, right? These are my proto-metamodern ideas that I was forming around the same time Metamodernism was emerging as an academic subfield in England, in London. So yeah, I think the standout ones, like I have a paper on Jesus actually, which can serve as a kind of companion to the metanoia piece, actually, to the extent I even like to dive into history, religious history, and stuff like that, and make any strong claims. There is where I made some claims that Jesus might not have been one person. There was many people named Jesus at the time. We all know the Gospels were written 100 years after Jesus supposedly died, and crucifixion was a normal practice. So I historicized, but I also said if Jesus was real, that he was this political rebel, a rebel without a clause. To be sure, was the subtitle. Exegesis of Jesus was the title of the paper, and so that's where it connects. But my favorites would be the Israel Politique and the Towards a Theory of Conspiracy, because those are both that I think are major themes of my work today. That and such that my article on Medium, Systemic Conspiracy as Social Pathology, is the kind of follow up to that article from 10 years ago. And let me finish on the Israel thing, because I said we were going to come back to that about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a big topic. So and in my conversation with Bard, that's the Patreon video, we talked about Israel too. I was happy that came up, was able to get a little bit of coverage, because part of my point is that always, like, nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody in our metamodern spaces has introduced the topic, and nobody has taken up my offers. They don't talk about it. And it's such a huge mistake, huge, damaging, harmful mistake. And in fact, David Fuller is someone I tried to communicate with this about over Facebook. And this was one of the times he blocked me. He didn't like what I was saying. I didn't like what he was saying either, but I didn't fold. And he blocked me, and essentially he was just upholding the status quo, and didn't want to talk about Israel, and was offering deflections. And it had a lot to do with the smears against Corbyn as anti-Semitic and as enabling anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. So again, these are things I wanted to talk about as they came up. I always want to talk about things like Israel-Palestine, because it's always relevant. I think it was last spring, right? There was basically a 2-month war in Sheikh Jarrah is one of the specific places where it was happening. But the Israel's annexation and like brutality against Palestinians and protesters is an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing thing. Just like the war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014. And so Ukraine thing happens, everybody wants to talk about that, right? And one of the interesting things that came up really quickly in the media coverage, you'd have the alternative left media channels pointing out the racism of various mainstream news outlets and their journalists and their broadcasters, and showing their cards and basically saying like candidly saying like, oh, this war in Ukraine, like it's nothing like these other wars. Like these are white people, like we should care. There's literally journalists on that level of like exposing themselves. And so a lot of other channels like Novara Media, Majority Report, Hassan and Piker, a whole bunch. They covered this. They picked up on it. Like, oh, look at the hypocrisy. And it's reproduced in the metamodern space. Like, oh, let's rush to this thing because we have some connection. We think we're more qualified to talk about it. And so I'm obviously anti-Putin, and I think this is totally just a war of aggression, and NATO should be disbanded. But I'm not going to toot that horn of like, oh, it's NATO's fault, it's the US's fault, we can actually sort of pinpoint the agency with Putin and his pathologies and his corruption and neuroses. That should be easy to do. And then we can also problematize NATO, US empire, all this kind of stuff. And we can also like lionize and like, support Ukraine pretty unilaterally. And we're seeing kind of global support mobilize around Ukraine. However, where it has always been a problem and where it becomes a deeper problem is like ignoring the other parts too of the world. And like Zelensky himself, like he's a Jew. And, I haven't been able to dig too deep into this in terms of finding exact quotes and stuff. So, not to say take it with a grain of salt, like take this very seriously, but also I have limited information about the full story. But suffice it to say, Zelensky has compared Ukraine to Israel in positive terms, to say we're a kind of independent nation, we're being besieged by other powers, blah blah blah, and because he's a Jew, I guess he has some kind of affinity for the Jewish homeland. But where this debate actually matters and should be resolved, be it resolved, and it was resolved in one of these intelligence squares debates in 2019 with Mehdi Hassan, be it resolved. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And that talking point won the day. It won that debate. Whereas what happens in the world is the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so the ultimate question is Zionism versus anti-Zionism. And so anti-Zionism is the correct worldview in this regard, because Zionism literally is just ethnostatism. Okay, and that's not good. It's not legal. It's not sane. It's just this fantasy of a simplistic solution to the problem. Like, oh, Jews are insulted or are driven out all over the world. They need, or they're exterminated in the case of the Holocaust. We need a Jewish homeland. And so, I mean, we're really just scratching the surface here. I had another old paper that preceded the Israel Politique one called, I think it was just called the First Zionist Congress, like just a very matter-of-fact title, because that's what it was about. And that's sort of the prehistory, right? The first, I forget the exact date, it was like 1896, something like that, around there. But that was the first Zionist Congress, right? Like the term has a deeper history, but it didn't become the movement that it is until that time. And at that time, there was debate. And that's very interesting to see. And the Zionists won the debate, but they weren't the correct ones. So this is where power, right? Just sort of sheer power wins out, whether it's ideology or material power behind it. But, a big part of the backstory of Israel Politique is this Israel lobby, which John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt introduced, wrote about, became very influential. And that's just to say, like, there's these, right-wing Christian organizations in the United States, and the United States as a foreign policy apparatus has a lot of money behind it to uphold the status quo of Israel, which means upholding this myth that gives it some sort of exceptionalism, like American exceptionalism, to say that, like, this is our empire, we're gonna keep it. So Zelensky making those comparisons positively, comparing Ukraine to Israel, actually in a dark way is consistent with the media coverage, the media coverage's racism. Right. So in both cases, it creates a kind of double standard where we take care of ourselves first and we neglect the other. And that's the wrong move. That's the wrong move. This is where Zelensky falls short. This is where metamodern people covering this topic fall short, is losing the bigger scope of these other problems and how they're always there. They're always extant. And we need to deal with them at the same time, if not before. So that's my hot take, if you will. And I talked with Jermaine Marvel last week, and we had a long conversation. We covered a lot of different things, but this is one of those things we touched on. And so, again, I support Ukraine, but it's a messy situation, and it's more complicated than most people get. And it's definitely more complicated than the contrarians who just say it's all about US empire. Like I say that sometimes, but it's not all about US empire. We already live in a multipolar world. The US is already a failing empire that continues to exert its last gasps of empire in different directions and in different contexts.
Well, here's the abrupt segue, which is you and I have enough convergence on positions and mutual affinity to be able to carry on pretty good Zoom conversations anyway. And yet I'm, somewhat homogeneously distributed over the Fliminal Web. I'm part of this integral thing to some degree. I'm part of this integral stage project to some degree, right? It has its virtues, has its limitations. In what ways am I a reactionary? Like, what are the critical elements you would bring towards me that I might want to consider?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So just as a kind of parallel point, not a segue, but just to say, like, you're inviting critique, which is rare, right? And to your credit, you've always been open. And similarly, Michael Garfield asked me for critique. He invited critique, and I delivered it. I tried to take him to task, to use his words, and that's the first Patreon video posted, and that's 2 hours of me listening to him podcasting and interjecting, taking him to task. And I bring that up as an example because I get along with him fine. I like most of his work, and so it's the same with you. And I only want to critique, and my critique's only going to be effective if it's actually solicited. So, because of our alliances and our convergences, I don't think you're a reactionary. I definitely think you're friends with a lot, though. And so that does make it kind of complicated, right? And honestly, I don't know where to go from that because with each person is a different case, really. I'd be happy to talk with each person on what makes them a reactionary. But in your case, like when I give you pushback or try to advise, it's always in the sense of like don't give them too much, or don't get caught up in this too much. And like obviously you have a very integral role, a very central role in trying to like mediate all these different people. And yeah, I applaud you for it. I mean, we need more people to do that and to echo the criticisms, right? So we're not trying to create an echo chamber. A lot of these spaces already are echo chambers, and they'll cease to be echo chambers if we can echo or reproduce each other's critiques, the best critiques, and break through. Because especially with some of my opponents who are like already disinclined to listen, they feel like they're doing a chore just to show up, it's not going to work. I know that. So yeah, I mean, and with the integral stuff, like I've been tried to be very clear on this, that it seems to be unavoidable that it's I don't know if it creates reactionaries, but it certainly enables them. It certainly facilitates them. And so this is reflected in a lot of the online integral groups, Facebook groups and whatnot, and specific people, and I always actually, one of the things we did together that I'm both proud of it and it was ineffective. And that was when you facilitated the debate between me and Brian Doherty. So I think we should be doing that kind of stuff 10 times as much, an order of magnitude more. But and then maybe it could be different. Maybe it could be effective. But so my point there is it happened because of you. He's one of those guys, like a lot of those other guys that remain persistent actors in integral spaces. And I want to have nothing to do with it, really, because I try and then I point out the flaws and nobody's interested. And so I'll go somewhere else. But just to bring it home, insofar as there is an integral left, right, Facebook group and Jeremy Johnson and a Discord and and Michael Brooks universe, the work that was being done there, that should be the core of integral, or it's nothing. It's nothing. It's going to continue to attract reactionaries because it like Wilbur himself, it purposefully has no political spine. It has no grounding, and it never will through somebody like Wilbur, because he's telling us, he's making it clear when he does things like say, oh, the intellectual dark web is second tier thinking or whatever. It's just showing that he's not paying attention. It's not thinking critically about those conversations. He's just reacting like a lot of other people in either in a heterodox way or a too open-minded, like, oh, this guy's a professor. He can't be a crank. Of course he can. This is part of the realization a lot of people have to come to within metamodernism, whether it's about themselves or about other people. If you're a PhD like Peterson and you've had a successful career relatively, you can still be a crank. You can still engage in pseudoscience. You can still engage in reactionary thinking, which Peterson does every day on Twitter. And so this just needs to be said again and again and again until we hit those tipping points, because I've tried to sugarcoat it in the past. I've tried to adapt my rhetoric so that it might get through to people in different places politically and intellectually. But when it comes to talking, I just want to be as clear as possible and get straight to the point. And that might include, drawing some definitive lines that we don't have time to unpack fully, right? Or because it's already been talked about. Like we've talked about Peterson a lot. I only bring certain things up is because they keep rearing their ugly head. They keep presenting themselves as opportunities to learn, but then it's wasted because people are still polarized. So yeah, long story short, I don't think you're a reactionary. I think you're not to say spread thin, but you're too integrated while also having this reflexivity and this criticality, which you share with me. We do it together, but it's also something you appreciate about my work on its own, because it's often something I do alone. right, to sort of issue authoritative critiques and challenges to different spaces, and that's for myself, to make sure I don't be reactionary. I don't get sucked into different discourses. And I certainly don't endorse every person that calls themselves a leftist. Right. So that brings us to the current landscape, which is pretty fragmented still, more fragmented than it used to be in recent years. I would say. So yeah, I think that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. I guess we're at the end. I want to appreciate your sharing a tour across your different kinds of projects and work with us. I would, when we have people on the integral stage, it's not necessarily an endorsement. But sometimes I do want to make an endorsement, and I would encourage people to solicit a critique from Brent. I would encourage people to get involved with his Patreon. And I had this idea partway through something you were saying of like, what if your Patreon users could select things for you to critically analyze? They could vote with their dollars. That would be an interesting project. And then you would feel like your work had a specific relevance.
I do want that. So some of the patrons aren't even active. They just donate to support the project, which is great. I'd love to have more of those, but I'd also like to have more active patrons. And so, some of the ideas I'm toying with are like, obviously people can access me, suggest things, but like that you could also earmark money for projects. And, keeping in mind, things cost money. So if you're a patron at the dollar level and you're going to earmark your dollar for a specific expense, you got to think real hard about how far that can actually go, as opposed to if somebody wants to give me $1,000 and earmark that for a video or whatever, or do it democratically, hundreds of people to contribute in that sense, then it would work. And just a final point, because you just, advise people to solicit critique from me. That's great. And like I said, like Michael Garfield did it. It was fun. I'll always like give a little bit for free, but here's what I really think is the rub. Like, you're going to get the best experience and the best like applicability of that critique if you pay for it. And this is where everybody is so cheap. Like, first of all, they don't even want the critique, right? For free or otherwise. And that's wrong. But second of all, there needs to be this shift in mentality that, people keep operating on the assumptions that like, open source and, just collaboration and co-creation, whatever, and goodwill, just all give ourselves freely to this project. But that does not enable like good critique or interventions. And, consultants are often paid thousands and thousands of dollars to give advice, not necessarily critique, but if they're getting critique, that's part of it's packaged in a way that is digestible. And because it costs money or costs time to create critique, it also takes time and has a certain cost for somebody to accept critique and to entertain it. You're going to get better value if you're paying for it. And that's like for multiple reasons, but also just having a nominal fee on something makes you more invested as a consumer. Like, oh, I bought this thing. Now there's a sunk cost fallacy at work. And now, I bought this chocolate bar, so I'm going to enjoy it, or whatever the psychology may be. But wouldn't that be something, right? If Perspective, for example, wanted to hire me to critique instead of hire me to write what I think are utterly bullshit puff pieces and whitewashing articles, right? Like, what a waste of real talent and opportunity and time and money to pay me to do that, when you could pay me for critique that then, because you paid for it, you might actually listen. There's really something magical about that in the opportunity. And so like, I appreciate you like posing that opportunity and telling people to solicit critique, and especially in the sense of it's clearly here it's friends doing it, like you or Michael Garfield soliciting it. Obviously, I'm not going to come in too hot. I'm gonna be a little bit more free, but also like giving care and attention to the way that those critiques land and are heard and can be implemented. And so at the end of it, I'm making kind of soft suggestions and lamentations, and then like it's out of my hands, right? Do what you will with it. So and Michael Garfield did not pay for that critique, by the way, which I was disappointed by, but nevertheless, like that's what I'm saying. I'll give you a little bit for free, anybody. And if it's out of my wheelhouse, I'll be the first to admit, like I can't peer review somebody's chemistry paper. I can't. I'm not literate, but I can audit your political beliefs, or your ideological liabilities. These are things that have been built into my project from day one, that are ironically very hard to monetize and commercialize. So yeah, so thanks for giving me that opportunity to pitch.
Yeah, let's hope people take that opportunity seriously. And to everybody who's listening, let's use Brent for what he's good at. And also for everyone who's listening, I will also critique you for $1,000. Yeah. Great talking with you, Brent. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Layman.